The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley. Chapter 13. Further Progress. His change of tactics had worked, although it made him feel like a brute. But only by arousing Quiven's anger could he stir her to continue the journey, and to remain would have menaced her safety and her health. She had a good head start on him. The silver sky was turning crimson in the west, night was coming on, so he hurried after her down the wet and slippery trail. At last it became so dark that he had to slow down and walk, and finally merely grope his way, shoving his feet ahead one after the other, in order to keep to the trail and not to stumble. Time and again his foot would touch something soft, and which would picture as some strange and weird Peruvian animal, a nooper for instance. Quickly he would withdraw his foot, then waiting in suspense for the creature either to go away or to spring upon him, at last he would cautiously poke his foot again forward and touch the object again, kick it slightly and find it was only a clump of Peruvian grass or a rotted piece of lichen log. Poor Quiven, how terrified she must be at such encounters! After a while he got used to the occurrences, and actually each succeeding one of them delayed him less than the preceding. You know, he said to himself, this will keep on until finally one of the obstacles will actually turn out to be an oper, and then it'll eat me alive before I get out of the way. Just then his groping foot touched another of these soft objects. "Get out of my way!" Chabad shouted, and gave it a kick. But this time it was not attached to soil. It yielded and wriggled a bit. Then it gave a particular groaning sound. Miles leaped backward and waited, but nothing happened. So he tried to circle the creature. Again the groan. His scientific curiosity got the better of his caution. He approached once more and investigated more closely, reaching down with his hand. The animal was covered in wet and muddy fur. It was Quiven. Tenderly he raised the crumpled form in his arms and groped on down the treacherous trail. Miles wondered how long he could bear up with this dead weight in his arms, but just as he was beginning to stagger, the road gave turn and flattened out, and there before him were lights, the flares and bonfires of a city. They had reached the plain. "Quiven!" he cried joyfully. "This is home! There ahead lies Verkingi!" But she made no reply. Her body was cold and still. Quickly he laid her on the ground and placed one ear to her chest. Thank the great Builder, her heart still beat. So he chafed her hands and feet and worked on her arms violently, back and forth, until she began to groan protestingly. "Quiven!" he cried. "Wake up! We're home!" "Are you here, Miles?" she murmured faintly. "Yes." "You won't make me walk any more?" "No." "Then I'll wake up for you," she murmured cheerfully, and promptly fell fast asleep. Again lifting her tenderly in the arms, he resumed his journey. On reaching the city, he circled the wall until he came to one of the gates, where stood the guard on the ground and shook her gently to consciousness. "Where am I?" she asked. "At the gates of Verkingi," Miles answered. She ran her hands rapidly over her mud-caked fur. "Oh, but I can't go in like this," she wailed. "I'm covered in mud from head to foot. Think how I must look. No, I must refuse to go in." "If you stay here," he urged mildly, "then when morning comes everyone will see you, the Princess Quiven, bedraggled and with mud, hanging around outside the city gates. Better far to go in now and take a chance of being seen by only a sentinel." "Oh, you beast, you beast!" she sobbed, beating him futilely with her tiny paws. For reply he seized her up in his arms, swung her across one hip, and shouted, "Open wide the gates of Verkingi for Chabad the Minorian, magician to Judd the excuse-maker, and to his excellency, Theof the Grim." The gates swung open, and the sentinel stared at them with surprise and some amazement. Miles whipped out his sword, and a smile froze on the soldier's face. "Thus do I teach men not to laugh at Miles Chabot the Earthman," he growled. "Remember that you have seen nothing this night." He handed the soldier the choice blade of Grod the Silent. The soldier smiled again. "I've seen nothing but a Roy, whom I robbed of his sword and drove off into the darkness. It is a fine sword, and I'll remember that I've seen nothing. May the great Builder bless Miles Chabot, the Minorian." Chabot glanced at his burden. Quiven the beautiful. No wonder she did not want to be seen. It always humiliates a lady not to look her best in public. But by the same token, no one could possibly recognize her. He might perfectly well have saved the sword. So he passed on through the city gates and streets, Finally, he had to put the girl down and ask her to help him find the way, which she did grudgingly. At the gate of Judd's compound, Miles again swung her across his hip before he commanded entrance. No swords this time, for diplomacy would take the place of payment. Miles Chabad, demanding entrance, he cried. The local guard inspected them carefully by light of the torch. It is Chabad, all right, he replied, and you look as though you've seen some hard fighting. But who is with you? A girl of the Roys, answered Miles. That is what the fighting was about. Not for mine, the soldier asserted, grimacing, though there is no accounting for tastes. They are filthy little beasts, and spitfires as well, so I'm told. My advice to you, sir, is to throw it down a well. Quiven wriggled protestingly. Perhaps I will, Miles laughed. At their own gate, at last, he placed her once more on her feet, whereat she shook herself free, raced into the house, slammed the door of her room. Chabad himself went right to bed without wasting to wash or do anything, and dropped instantly to sleep the moment he touched his pile of bedding. Yet so intent was he on wasting no time in getting Cupia on the air that he was up early the next morning. He found his laboratory force sadly demoralized, owing to the absence of Quiven and himself, but he quickly brought order about the chaos and set the men to work on their first real construction job, to which all other work had been mere preliminary steps. Quiven kept to her rooms, but one of the other maids roguishly informed him, "The Golden One says she hates you." Now that his fire bricks were ready, Miles Cabot laid out on paper the plans for a smelting plant, all the units of which were to be lined with fire brick. First, he designed a furnace for roasting the ore. This furnace was to be in two sections, one above the other, the lower holding charcoal fire and the upper holding the ore. Later, he planned to use the sulfur fumes of his roaster to make sulfuric acid, which in turn he would use to make sal ammonic for his batteries. But at present he had not yet figured out this process in detail. The smelting furnace, for smelting the roasted ore into copper matter, was to consist of a chimney about 2 feet in diameter, sloped sharply outward about 2 feet, and thence sloped gradually in again for the height of about 10 feet. Near the bottom were to be a number of small holes leading from an air passage. This air passage and the vent for the hot flames from the top of the smelter were to run in parallel pipes made of hollow brick tile on 2 chambers containing a checkerwork design of fire brick. The 2 pipes were to be interchangeable, so that when the exhaust had heated one of the checkerwork grids to a red heat, the pipes could be switched, and the incoming air would be warmed by passing through the heated grid. From noper hide and wood, he'd easily construct bellows to pump the air to blast. Molten copper mat and slag would be separately run off the 2 separate openings at different levels near the bottom of the blast furnace. To further refine the mat, he designed a besimeter converter, that is to say, a barrel-shaped box of layers of fire clay, the inner layer being very rich in quartz sand. This barrel, when filled with molten mat, would be laid on its side, and a hot blast introduced through holes near the side, which would convert the mat into pure copper in about 2 hours. The first converter he made was rather small, and he expected it would not last very well without metal reinforcements, and of course he would have no metal for reinforcing purposes until after he'd run off at least 1 heat. For the extraction of iron he made crucibles of fire clay, which he set in deep holes in the ground. On the second morning after the unpleasant homecoming, Quiven appeared. All her rage had burned out, and she was meek and subdued. With downcast eyes she reported to Miles, "I'm ready to go to work now." With a welcoming smile he patted her golden-furred shoulder, whereat her old anger started to flare again, but this one remaining ember merely flickered and died out, and she submitted with a shrug of resignation. So the radio man explained to her his plans for the furnaces, then leaving her in charge of the work, he set out once more to the river of the Silver Sands, this time accompanied by a heavy guard of Verkingi soldiers, flying the blue flag, as agreed with Prince Odo of the Roys. As he was departing, Quiven flung her arms around him and begged him not to go, certain of destruction, but he gently disengaged himself, smiling indulgently at this show of childish affection. "My dear little girl," he admonished, "most of our troubles last time came from your following me. This time I warn you that I shall be displeased if you fail to stay closely to home and complete my 2 magic furnaces for me. Promise me you will." So with tears of dread in her blue eyes, she promised, and the expedition set forth. They were gone about 5 days. The trip proved uneventful, from any except a scientific viewpoint. They returned bearing several pounds of silvery grains, placer mined from the river sand. Also some large lumps of galena crystal and nearly a ton of zinc blende. They found that, under skillful direction of Quiven, the furnaces were nearly completed. Quiven of the Golden Flame was overjoyed at Cabot's safe return, while even he had to confess considerable relief. He complimented her warmly on the progress of the furnaces and noted her pleasure at the expressions of approval. A few details which had perplexed her were quickly straightened out, and the work was rushed to completion. The next tested the silver grains, which he had brought from the river. His method was a very simple one, invented by himself. It consisted in filling a clay cup with water and weighing it, then weighing a quantity of metal, then putting this metal in the water and weighing the whole. A simple mathematical calculation from these three weights gave him the specific gravity of the metal. This process was repeated a number of times to avoid error, and gave an average of the figure of 21.5, which he remembered to be the specific gravity of pure platinum. At a further test he hammered some of the supposed platinum into a thin sheet, and attempted without success to melt it. Then he laid a sliver of one of his lead bullets on it, and tried again, with the result that the lead melted and burned a hole through the metal sheet. This test convinced him that he truly had found platinum. Cabot turned next his attention to the glass making. For ordinary glass he would need quartz, soda, potash, and limestone. The reason for his employing both soda and potash, instead of merely one or the other, was that together they would have a lower fusing point and thus be easier for him to handle with his crude equipment. For glass, for his tubes, he would use litharge in place of the limestone. The quartz and the limestone were already available. Soda would be a byproduct of sal ammoniac when he got around to making it, but this would not be until he had the sulfuric acid from his copper ore, which was the most complicated process as he remembered it. Potash he got simply by dripping water through wood ashes, evaporating the water, roasting the sediment, dissolving again in water, letting the impurities settle, and then evaporating the clear liquid, and roasting again. He started this process at once, but he had no idea how to make litharge. Furthermore, he could not blow his glass until he had metal tubes, so he abandoned further steps for the present. While he was pondering over these problems, a messenger arrived demanding his immediate presence at the quarters of Judd the excuse-maker. Judd was in a state of great excitement when the Earthman arrived. Said Judd, "Do you remember what you told me about the beasts of the South, who swim through the air, talk soundless speech, and use magic slingshots like yours, which you captured from the Roys near Sur?" "Yes," Cabot replied. "I hope that by this time I have given sufficient demonstration of truthfulness so that you now believe the story." "Oh, I believed it at the time," Jade hastily explained, "but now I have proof of it, for we have captured one of these beasts. That is, we think it is one of them. I want you to see and identify it before we present it to Theofgr the Grim." "Thereby displaying commendable foresight," Miles commented. "Where is this Formian?" "In a cage in the zoo," the Bear King noble replied. "Come, I will take you there." So together the two threaded the streets of Erkingi to the zoo. This was part of the city which the Earthman had never before visited. Its denizens fascinated him. There were huge water snakes with human-like hands. There were spherical beasts with rows of legs around the equators, and rows of eyes around the tropic Cancer, and a circular mouth rimmed with teeth at the North Pole. But at this point Judd urged him on to another room, where he promptly forgot all the other creatures at the sight of which met his eyes. In a large wooden cage in the center of the room was an enraged ant-man gnawing at the bars, while a score or so of King's warriors stood around and prodded him with spears. "Stop!" Judd shouted at the soldiery, whereat they all fell back obediently. This called the attention of the imprisoned beast to the newcomers, so he looked up and stared at them. Cabot stared back, and then he rushed forward to the cage.